Hello, everyone. This is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today, we are talking to Dr. Marcus Ross to discuss his new book he was in. It is a debate book on the historicity of Adam and Eve. Basically, four different views from four different Christians on how the idea of Adam interacts with the Bible and whether Adam was historical or not historical, or different positions that incorporate that without contradicting science. How are you doing today, Dr. Ross?
Oh, I'm doing great, Zach. Thanks so much for having me on again. It's a pleasure to be back.
Awesome. All right. So, of course, people are familiar with your work, but of course, you're a young Earth creationist. You've done all kinds of work on dinosaurs and all that other stuff. But you're in this book, and
Yeah,
people are just going to be interested. Could you tell us about the book as well as, actually, just give us a summary or just like of the book, the general idea what it's about.
sure. Well, the book's title is Perspectives on the Historical Adam and Eve. It's edited by Ken Keithley, who's at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and includes viewpoints from four different proponents. On the one end, you've got Kenton Sparks. He's the first chapter up, and he takes an errantist view of the Bible. If any of your viewers are familiar with his book, God's Word in Human Words, for example, they would know that Kenton kind of stands a little bit outside of evangelicalism in not holding to inerrancy in the way that most evangelicals do. And so his perspective is basically that, hey, the Bible was talking about Adam and Eve as real people. Creation happened in 6 days. There was a global flood of Noah, all these different components of the early Genesis narratives, right? The proto history or primeval history, however you like to place put the name to it. And he says, they certainly thought that that was the case, and it turned out that they were wrong. Paul thought that that was true, but he's not right. So he's going to be part of the kind of the new perspectives on Paul group and whatnot that are pushing against the idea of an inerrantist perspective of history. But he will say that it's okay. We still have communication of God through these stories, through these accounts. But his perspective is science is going to be able to do what science does. And if it turns out that there is a historical couple, great. But if there isn't, that doesn't matter either, because he doesn't think that the Bible is ultimately the book to do that kind of work for things. So in his discussion, he spends a lot of time talking about the argument for why inerrancy doesn't work. He gives a lot of different kinds of examples. And then after that, it's actually a pretty quick, brisk pass through some of the other relevant issues, including science, just kind of saying, scientists are doing what they're doing. And I'm not bothered about this. And all of us who wrote in the chapter were asked to address three different components. One was, what is your overall viewpoint on the narratives of Genesis 1, 2, and following? And also New Testament passages that might relate to Adam. So what's your biblical perspective on Adam? Second, what is the way that you think science connects to that perspective? And third, how does this perspective between science and religion influence the work and the ministry of the church? So we could certainly talk about a lot of other things, but along the way, we were supposed to address at least those three types of issues. And I would say, Kenton's lead off there took that errantist perspective on the Bible. So he represents kind of the left wing side of things. I represented the right wing, so to speak, right? If you got to have, a left wing nut job, you got to have a right wing crackpot, right? And I'm supposed to be that guy in that I am an inerrantist who holds to the Genesis primeval history as actual history, as providing us with details about the historical events of the world. Not that it's history in the same way that you and I might think of history in a modern sense, but nonetheless that it is giving us historical details and documents or documentation of these things. And so my perspective is that the creation week represents an actual week of work in which God created the world, and that the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11 help to bracket that time of creation to something that happened within several thousands of years ago, and that Adam and Eve were miraculously created individuals who were the first of all humans that have ever existed. There was nothing like us before or beside them at the time of creation. That the flood was a global event that reset humanity's population. That becomes an important component of what I argue later on. And so from the biblical perspective, that's where I stood. And then from a scientific perspective, sought to make a case that the evidence from paleoanthropology that we have, for example, of different human-like individuals in the fossil record, things like Neanderthals, Homo erectus, could be understood within that broad young Earth creation perspective. And to answer the third question about how does that impact the church, mostly that we can still defend a reliability to the Bible in its earliest passages, and that this can help give us a sense of trust in what the Bible has to say, not just in the Gospels or just in certain components, but the Bible across the board is reliable. So those are the two endpoints, right? Those are the two sides. And sitting in between are William Lane Craig and Andrew Loke. And William Lane Craig is in this book because he wanted it. This was his idea. He had just recently finished his book on the historical Adam called In Quest of the Historical Adam. And he wanted to keep the ball rolling, right? Actually, his book hadn't even been published yet, and he was already pitching the multiple views book to introduce people to his new idea, as well as to bring further discussion from folks who hold to a genealogical Adam view, like those of Joshua Swamidass. And that's where Andrew Loke comes in. So Bill Craig's view is that Genesis 1 through 11, the narrative components of that, so the account of the creation of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, etc., Noah, are what he calls mytho-history. He believes that when you take a look at how myth is defined or categorized and classified by folklorists, that he puts together kind of 10 statements about what myth is. And he thinks that the Genesis narratives check off about 8 of those boxes. One of them certainly excluded because there's no connection between God and nature in terms of like God and nature are not one and the same. That's typical of myth, but not obviously something that the Bible talks about.
Right.
So he still says that, hey, we've checked off a whole bunch of boxes. And so it looks like these are more mythological constructions, but he does believe that the genealogies provide some type of historical interest for these stories and relate them to real history. So hence he uses this term mytho-history, borrowed from Thorkild Jakobsen, but used differently than Jakobsen did. And that's one of the criticisms that Craig has heard since he published his book, is he uses mytho-history in a very different way than Jakobsen does, which is more about myth itself rather than history. It's kind of telling myth as if it's history, but knowing it's still not myth. And Craig is saying, no, it's really history, but it's told in a mythic way. Craig is unusual, and I think something to be appreciated here in the way that he views the human fossil record. He thinks that there is abundant evidence that things like Neanderthals are indeed behaving and acting like human beings, and show all the kind of cultural advances and developments, evidences of higher cognitive capability that put them on the same plane as you and I as members of Homo sapiens. And so Craig kind of reasons, as he usually does, very logically, right? If we are human and the Neanderthals are human, then the common ancestor between the two of us must likewise be human. And he situates that common ancestor within a group that we call Homo heidelbergensis, living somewhere around 750,000 years ago. So he says that would be the time at which Adam would have existed. Now, he doesn't think that the Genesis account gives us Adam, but he does think that there are possibly 3 passages in the New Testament that absolutely commit Christians to the idea of a historical Adam. Specifically, that's going to be Romans 5, Acts 17, and 1 Corinthians 15. Those 3 passages, and he only talks about one. He only talks about Romans 5 in this book, but in his fuller treatment, he does talk about those 3 as the ones that require an Adam. So I find that interesting. That Craig is not committed to an Adam because of Genesis. He's committed to an Adam because of the New Testament. And so that's kind of his rationale. And he actually doesn't even talk about the third question at all. He just leaves that one and that's the end. Then we've got Andrew Loke. He represents the second middle position, a little closer to me than to Craig. But Andrew Loke, like Joshua Swamidass, holds that Adam can be a real individual, historic individual, who is the ancestor of us all, if he is a genealogical ancestor only. That is, there were plenty of other humans out there, plenty of other members of Homo sapiens in this case. But Adam was not one of them. He could have been specially created or maybe selected out of that. He leaves lots of options on the table. This is part of his argument. But once kicked out of the garden, then the children of Adam and Eve start to intermarry with those people that are outside in the rest of the world who had evolved through standard Darwinian processes overseen by God, for example. So he says this is a way to fully reconcile evolutionary theory and the evolutionary development of Homo sapiens with a historical Adam, whose ancestry then filters in over time till eventually everybody on earth is somehow genealogically connected to Adam. And that has to be before Jesus, for example. So when Paul is writing that all people are within Adam, that's got to be true. So Andrew's chapter is very, very different than everybody else's, because Andrew doesn't do kind of what I did in describing his idea. He doesn't just kind of lay out all the steps. Instead, what he does is what's called a possible worlds evaluation, where he basically sets up a whole bunch of different boxes that any model of human origins that is to be orthodox in Christian faith has to be able to check off. And he goes through all these 8 or 10 different types of things and basically says, my model checks off the box. My model checks off this box and this box. And it could do it in these different ways, or this one's got several options and it doesn't matter to my model and what have you. So one of the things that you'll see in the responses is that both Bill Craig and myself kind of restate the whole genealogical model itself, because if you were to read it as just a regular reader, without much context, it would actually be rather difficult to kind of figure out what exactly the model that Andrew's talking about in the chapter is, because he talks about how his model comports with all of these things, but he doesn't really just lay it out. You got to kind of pick up and glean from the writing and the prose where the details of the model are. So it makes for a kind of challenging chapter in that regard. Whereas if Josh Swamidass had been the author for this, it would have been a lot more like the other chapters in that way.
Yeah. So just to give a quick summary there. So, what's his name? Kenton Sparks. Just want to make sure I got the names right. So Kenton Sparks, he basically is just like, hey, science says this, and that contradicts with, a historical Adam. So we're just gonna say, hey, the historical Adam thing, that must not be historical. He's not for whatever reason, he doesn't have a problem with, errors in the text. He still thinks Christianity is true, of course. I think it's really interesting to ponder and think about. I'm not sure. I found myself all throughout the book, like just being like, hey, you can mention this argument or this argument or this argument, like to support your view, but they didn't do it for whatever reason. So like it's really interesting view. I'm not sure what to think about it as far as like, I would like to see more argumentation in it actually. But then you have Craig, who something very lots of people like kind of get confused about, because he does think that Adam was historical, and he does think that Genesis is true, but he wouldn't categorize that as just like, certainly wouldn't categorize it as 100% like literal historical journalistic account.
Right. No.
I heard that he like some other scholars use the word like proto-history, or kind of like a prehistory idea, and that he would also describe it that way, or like they're kind of talking about the same thing. I think that was James Hoffmeyer who uses that word. I mean, that's interesting. Do you know how much Craig would say of Genesis 1-11 is historical?
Yeah, I've been in the room when he's been asked that question by others, and what he has said is that it's like coffee and cream. That the myth and the history are blended together in such a way that you could not possibly really tease out what's history and what's myth, except that he does. Except that he is deciding that certain components of the narrative are clearly in his mind. Fantastic, clearly mythological, clearly incorrect. So to get a sense of like what component of Genesis, say 2 or 3, does Craig think is correct? The only thing that I think Craig would say that we are committed to is that Adam was a real individual who failed a test by God. But he certainly doesn't think that there was anything like a serpent that tempted. He certainly doesn't think that there was anything like a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He calls that magical fruit, right? He doesn't think that God was in any way anthropomorphized during the creation of Adam. He views that as clearly just way out of bounds, that God would somehow deign to take on a corporeal looking visage during the creation of Adam. He thinks that's just one of the terms he uses is palpably false, which are strong words, honestly, for an evangelical to use when describing any aspect of the biblical text. Craig's doing that for a little bit of shock value, but he doesn't shy away from it at all. I mean, he's solely, fully committed, I should say, to that. When he says there's fantastic elements and things that are palpably false, he then goes and says, and these are what they are. So I appreciate the candor that he has with that. But I think that it actually works against his whole coffee and cream analogy, because he's like, nope, that's, this doesn't count. And I think I don't know why exactly he takes that stance otherwise. And it's interesting. If you've read through his book, right, the original book, it's huge. It's 380 some pages or whatever, and he never addresses Genesis 1, which is a point he ultimately criticizes me in this short little chapter that I've got about not fleshing out Genesis 1. Like, Bill, you had 400 pages and we didn't hear anything about your views of Genesis 1. He starts his perspective on Adam with Genesis 2, recognizing, however, that Genesis 1, verses 26, 27, 28, the sixth day relates to the creation of Adam. He thinks that those two are talking about the same kinds of events. So he doesn't take a sequential view of Genesis 1 and 2. He takes a synchronistic perspective in a sense, but I'm actually kind of putting a few words in his mouth on that, because he's really never made it clear what he thinks Genesis 1 as a document is doing.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's lots of good, or at least somewhat plausible options for Genesis 1 that don't necessarily mean you have to think that like this is some completely like 21st century historical account. There might have been some poetic language used. But yeah, certainly, I'd like some commentary or argumentation for that.
Right.
I mean, at least on face value, maybe those views are wrong, but at least on face value, it seems like they're plausible in some way. So yeah, it seems to me like Craig takes a similar view to John Walton in regards to like, hey, there are some things that, well, maybe like the whole coffee and cream thing. It seems like that kind of contradicts with what he's saying in other places, but it seems to me at least that if we're going to take his view, that we could probably say like, hey, there are some things that seem pretty clearly not to be historical. Some things, although most of it's probably like, it's hard to tell really what's going on there. And that's kind of what Walton does, John Walton. But he takes like there's like kind of like it's based on some type of something that actually happened, but not necessarily how it's described.
Right.
Would you say that someone like William Lane Craig, I don't want to talk about Sparks because you have that whole inerrancy discussion. Do you think someone like Craig and Andrew Loke, for you, do you think their views contradict with inerrancy or anything in the New Testament, or is it more of just a thing like would you say, hey, it's possible but just very unlikely?
That's a good question. I'll certainly have more differences with Craig in terms of his approach to the theological side of things. His approach to Genesis as mytho-history, I think, is highly problematic, as I detail in my critique. That of the 10, characteristics of myth, really everything boils down to 2. There's a bunch that are just so vague as to not be really helpful of identifying myth versus other things.
Mm-hmm.
And his argument basically comes down to etiology is the origin of things, and these fantastic elements are palpably false items. So really, I don't see that Craig has done a workable job of showing and demonstrating that the narratives of Genesis look like myth. I really don't see that at all. I think what it comes down to is ultimately Craig's own personal incredulity about some of the items in there, and saying these are clearly fantastic elements.
Yeah.
These are clearly things that we cannot believe, so we shouldn't. And maybe the ancients didn't believe it either. But he leaves that option open. Like, if the ancients believed it, but we don't now, we can call it myth, even if, I don't know, they wouldn't have. So in that regard, on the Old Testament, I think that Craig's approach to Genesis 1 through 11 is very inconsistent compared to the way that we see the other writings in the rest of Genesis, even, the types of things that would be considered fantastic elements later on, like, Joseph, sorry, not Joseph, Israel wrestling with an angel, right? Jacob wrestling with the angel, which was God, right? Because later on he says, I wrestled with God and lived. So that's the sort of thing that you kind of go, would God wrestle with a man and like not completely destroy him? That seems fantastic to me. But that's clearly, part of what is considered the historical part of Genesis by anybody who doesn't just disagree with historicity of Genesis as a whole. When it comes to the New Testament, I think that Craig's arguments are far too restrictive in what he allows to talk and speak to Adam. He builds this whole edifice of passages in the New Testament that are asserting Adam's existence versus those that are simply speaking about Adam in the story of Genesis. So he has these illustrative passages versus these assertorical statements that he cleaves apart. And I think Hans Matawemi, in a response to this, really kind of put the nail down on this one. And that was, I don't think that the New Testament writers were so schizophrenic in the way that they were considering these documents. That Paul is writing about Adam in one passage simply as an illustrated human, and another time in a later passage as asserting his existence. I don't think that Paul is going to be teasing these things out, or Peter or Jesus are going to be teasing these out between asserting their existence and simply using them as an illustration. Well, in order to use them as an illustration, you might just be assuming their existence. So those are things that I think are rather problematic.
Mm. Yeah. So just for clarity there, so you'd say that there's some major problems with this view. If we take out the whole things. Okay, just for the audience's clarity here. This was actually a quote in response to you. So like you presented your case and then he responded. He says, "I agree, but that talking about he says that I'll just read the whole thing. So he gives talking about Marcus. He says Marcus gives for reading the primeval history literally is that the genealogies structuring it show that we are to understand the narratives as dealing with real events involving real figures. I agree, but that the evidence falls short of proving that the stories are to be read literalistically, involving, for example, a recent creation in 6 consecutive 24-hour days, a humanoid deity walking and talking in the garden, non-miraculous magical fruit, and a talking snake." So he's mentioned this in other places. Like, I maybe I'm missing it, but I don't know like any place that he like gives like a very like very detailed reason for why like a humanoid deity walking and talking in the garden, magical fruit, talking snake, why those are like just the most crazy things in the world.
Yeah. Creation in 6 days is another one that he says is fantastic, which again, I don't know why it is, as far as from the standpoint of the literature in the ancient Near East and the Israelites, why would that be, crazy talk in a sense? The idea that God would take on physical form, I don't think that he's done much justification for that. I mean, he does talk about it at length in his book, but he certainly doesn't do that here in the multiple views view or book that we have. So yeah, it's, unfortunately, I think with Bill in the response, you just kind of get a litany of kind of some of the same critiques that he has in his chapter, and they just kind of get hit again. And we can't look at the ancient text this way. If we're committed to Adam the way that Marcus says in the New Testament, then we're committed to some other fictional characters that are mentioned as if they're real. So we can't do that. I think one of the things that is most interesting about Craig in his writing on this, especially coming from his book, is like on page 12 or 17, it's like super early on. He says, if the young earth creationist hermeneutic is correct, then we are going to have to seriously reconsider our ideas on inerrancy. And so, and he says this multiple times. He's also said it he might have said it in this chapter. I can't remember right off the top of my head. He said it in some of the other distillations of the book that have been published on websites and whatnot. This is a real sticking point for him. He finds that the young earth creation hermeneutic has some footing to it. He doesn't think it's correct, but he does think that it has some solid footing to it. And so clearly the answer has got to be somewhere else, because I don't think that he feels that kind of an older progressive creation view, a day age view, is workable. I don't think that he views, certainly not Walton's view, as workable. He critiques that very heavily in his book. So he kind of scans out the perspectives that are there from evangelicals, and he says, like, the young earth creation perspective, I can see textually why you might hold that, but we can't. Everything else in the middle over here I don't like, so I'm going to have to come up with my own, and this one's obviously then going to be the answer, this mytho-historical approach to it. I remember him saying that the first time he heard that term mytho-historical back in like 2016, I think he had said it was, listening to another talk, he said, that's the word, that's what I'm looking for. And you had mentioned James Hoffmeyer before, using the term proto-history. Bill had said that, those are kind of like the same term. I think Hoffmeyer would greatly disagree with characterizing Craig's mytho-history as something similar to or familiar to proto-history or primeval history, as he would use it. Those are not going to be the same at all. And folks watching could easily pick up a Three Views book that had Kenton Sparks in it again, as well as Hoffmeyer and one other person, blanked on who that is, but three very good Old Testament scholars talking about what is, Genesis 1 through 11 doing as a text. Wenham, that was the other one, Gordon Wenham. So I was some serious power with all three of them.
Right. Yeah. No, that was on his Craig said that on his podcast recently.
Okay.
I found that interesting. Like, I could definitely see the similarities between Craig and Walton's view, but definitely Hoffmeyer. I mean, he spends a lot of time, saying, "Hey, the Exodus is like historical." Yeah.
Right.
Now, maybe Hoffmeyer might have said, like, "Hey, like, there are certain parts that aren't like completely like 21st century historical, literal, journalistic account or whatever." Like maybe some mostly young Earth creationists would say. Or describe it as, at least. That is interesting. I don't know Hoffmeyer's view that well, as far as like what he would say is historical, or like how he would describe that exactly. But I had the same response there. I just wanted to say, like the whole magical fruit, talking snake. So like, I think it was Kenton Sparks who either said in this book or the other book that you just referenced, where he was like, "Hey, yeah, some people in ancient times seem to think that, like, the text, I can't remember what it was the Epic of Gilgamesh or what, that they, at least some people in that time, did think that, like, their myths were historical." That doesn't necessarily mean that the writer originally wrote it at, like, intending to be historical.
Right.
or mythical, but that's certainly worth talking about.
And I think we're in a fairly similar situation when we turn to the pages of the New Testament and we see how New Testament writers are, utilizing individuals from Genesis 1 through 11. It seems to me, at least, and certainly that's the whole point of the book, is that there's debate, right? But it seems to me, at least, that, when you find Paul or Jesus or Peter talking about people like Adam, people like Noah, etc., they seem to be speaking of them as if they were real people who lived in the past and did actual things. And one of the points that I bring up in my chapter is when we're going through the book of Romans, right before chapter 5, where the focus narrows on Adam so much, right before that is a very extended discussion of Abram and his faith, and how his faith is a model for both the Jews and the Gentiles who are in this mixed group of Christian believers in Rome that Paul hasn't even gotten to see yet, right? And the reason why Abraham can be such a good model for Christian faith to both Jews and Gentiles is that he was a Gentile, right? There were no Jews yet. He was going to be the father of the Jews. And it was his faith in God prior to the sign of the circumcision, right? That makes you Jewish, right? It's prior to all of that Abraham shows and displays faith. So yes, Gentiles can have faith in God. And yes, Jews, of course, have faith in God. And the Jews get the law and all these other sorts of things. But the entire argument is predicated on there being a real man by the name of Abram who actually did follow God and do his commands and show us that faith in God was possible. The very next thing, that we kind of move into almost is Adam. And so I think that it's a very strong literary component or kind of connection that's being made here between historical things, talking about the law, then going further back to Abram, and then now going even further back to Adam. Where's the source for the problem? Why is it that sin has, corrupted this entire world? Why is it that people can't believe right, even when we all know that there's a God who made us out there, starting in Romans 1. But that big, long logical flow walks us back in time, basically from the problems of the present all the way to the beginning and the source of the problems in Adam. And I think it's going to be very, very difficult to argue that those are not historic individuals. I think that's where we end up coming to those questions about inerrancy. Can you be an inerrantist and say Adam doesn't exist? I think that's a very tall order. I think that's a really hard one to do. I like people to be able to self-identify and self-define. So I don't want to, by my own criteria, decide you're this, you're that, you're not in, etc. But on the other hand, if you start saying, yes, the Bible says this, but it really doesn't say this, it's saying something completely different, not talking about a literary problem or things like that. Not, we've misunderstood the genre type of thing. But yes, Paul did mean Adam. We know better. So we have to come up with something else. I think that's the sort of thing that moves you out of inerrancy. And Craig is trying to avoid that. Sparks has decided that's fine. You can still be a Christian. I mean, you can still be a Christian and a non-inerrantist, obviously. And Andrew Loke is going to say, no, inerrancy is another way we can do this, and we can affirm evolution. We just need to have this other approach to looking at Adam as a genealogical ancestor. And he thinks that's going to save us from, potential calamity by holding on to something like, young earth creationism. Well, I'm representing that side that everybody's trying to avoid, and Kenton's representing the other side that people are trying to avoid. And you've got these two positions that are trying to carve out space in the middle and say, oh, you don't have to be an extreme on one way or the other. My question actually would be, is the middle actually right? Just because there are two end points to a discussion doesn't mean that the truth doesn't lie closer to one than the other. And my wife had a great example of that one time. She heard my two boys in the back of the van, because of course, we have a van. Yay. And she heard my boys arguing. And she was listening for a little bit, and then she cut in and she started talking to them and sorting out what was probably the truth in the middle. And my boys eventually said, Mom, we weren't actually having an argument. We were acting like we were having an argument, but it was really this. This was what was true. And we were just having a pretend fun argument with one another. And my wife picked up from that, like, first off, maybe I should check with my kids to see if they actually are having an argument. But the other part was, I have always assumed, right, that as a parent, one of the things that you usually do is you stand in the middle as a referee and you adjudicate between the two sides. and you
Mm-hmm.
try to come down to a middle point that, is a good balance between the two. But the reality is, sometimes the truth is not in the middle. Sometimes the truth is actually all to one side or the other, or 90% there. And it's not in this kind of happy medium, which is what Craig and Loke are trying to split the difference on. They're trying to say you can have Adam and deep time and evolution, and it's okay. We just need to understand the text in some slightly different ways. Whereas Kenton and I, we got a chance to actually meet each other at the very beginning of this process. When we first wrote our papers, we came to Southeastern and had a small mini conference. It's kind of a little confab. Craig was supposed to be there as well, but he unfortunately contracted COVID plus pneumonia and was hospitalized. It was touch and go. Praise the Lord, he made it through. He was fine. And Andrew Luke had to Skype in from Hong Kong, where he lived, because again, traveling during COVID, he was not sure if he'd ever even be able to get back into Hong Kong if he left. So it ended up being Kenton and I as the two writers that met there, and there were about 20 other people for it. And Kenton and I got along great. I mean, we just really enjoyed one another. And, at one point I kind of leaned over to him and I said, strange bedfellows, aren't we? And he looked at me and said, I was thinking the exact same thing, right? Because when it comes down to it, he and I read the text and understand the text to be doing pretty much the same thing. And that's one of the things I said in my response to Kenton, was that, we both basically agree that the text is trying to tell us about creation in 6 days, an original couple without any other humans before or beside, a real temptation and sin and fall with cosmic consequences, a real flood, a real ejection from the garden. All those sorts of things we think is what the text is really trying to tell us. That's not just the surface answer, which I think it is the surface answer, but it's much more than that. As you go down, I think that it's a deeply interconnected, well knit together concept and perspective that the rest of the Bible is building on in order to get us to an understanding of redemption's final, consummation in Jesus Christ. And the big difference between Kenton and I is I think that history actually is true, and he thinks that it actually isn't. And then sitting in between are those who are trying to say components of this are right and wrong. And Kenton kind of talks about that as he interacts with the others as well.
Yeah. I appreciate all those helpful thoughts. I certainly agree. It isn't always the middle position. You can't just assume that, hey, there's got to be a middle way. Sometimes it is the
Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father by. I mean, there isn't kind of a middle way, between that and pantheism. It just doesn't work.
Right. So I want to get your thoughts on Craig's. Let's see. So like he, in response to you, I guess he didn't feel like there was a lot of space to make any, big, strong arguments or whatever. But he's basically, he said, so, okay, let me give some summary there. So he references how you mentioned like the flood, and 2 Peter 3, it talks about Noah and a flood. And basically we're like, hey, yeah, this means that, the text is historical, and I think that you also believe that means the text is global. And Craig was like, no. And basically, if you read the quote, he specifically mentions like, hey, there are other parts of the Bible that talk about Jewish folklore and mythology, such as Janus Jambres, Michael's battle with the devil over Moses' corpse, and the rolling well that accompanied the Israelites through the desert. And he's basically like, hey, like, just because someone references a Jewish or Greek idea, like he goes into more detail in his book. Like he mentions how the word Tartarus is used, which is a Greek, kind of like the underworld, but more of a Greek idea. So he's basically like, hey, this writer Peter is referencing all these ideas. We can't just simply assume that the text is historical just because they're referencing it. And he uses like a whole bunch of different thoughts. He doesn't go specifically into 2 Peter 3 in his book, but he does talk about all these other instances. There was one phrase that I wanted to mention that he uses. Uh, like he says, dang, I guess I won't be able to find it. Um, yeah, either way. Yeah, okay. So, he quotes Walt and he says something like, "What Jude is doing is a literary truth, not a historical truth." So, like, they're referencing literary ideas maybe as like illustrations, or,
Mhm.
uh, you know, maybe even they do think they're mythical, but there is truth in myth. So what do you think about that concept? Because it seems like you're saying, like, hey, the New Testament writers are referencing these people because they're historical.
Yeah, and I hope that my argument is a little bit more nuanced than that, or a little more, I hope, robust.
Yeah.
So when we take a look at 2 Peter 3,
Mm,
what we see is that Peter is making a direct comparison. First off, the context is the Jewish believers in Christ, that the early Christians are being approached by skeptics of Jesus as Messiah and saying, where's the promise of his coming, right? Jesus said he's coming back. He hasn't. And they say that ever since the beginning, it's been the same, just, ever since when the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they have since the beginning of creation. And Peter's response to that, first off, he's quoting that line that's being used against them, that all things continue since the beginning of creation. Thanks for bringing that up
yeah.
for us. So yeah, they deliberately, in saying that, then where is the promised return? For ever since the ancestors died, all things continued as they were from the beginning of creation. So that's the challenge being presented to the early church. And Peter says, concerning these scoffers, these skeptics, who are Jewish, and that's the important component here, is that these are Jewish folks, not like Romans who don't know the scriptures. He said, for they deliberately suppress this fact that by the word of God, the heavens existed long ago, and earth was formed out of water and by means of water. So he goes back to creation, where they say the argument begins, and then said, through these things, it says here, through these same waters, the world existing at that time was destroyed when it was deluged with waters. Okay, so this is a Greek word cataclysmos, which is used in association with Noah's flood in the New Testament.
Mm,
But by the same word, the present heavens and earth are being reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction for the ungodly. So what Peter does here, and what I mentioned in my chapter, is he sets up a threefold parallelism between the creation of the world, the flood, and the return of Jesus,
mm,
right? The creation of the world is obviously a universal event. Jesus's return is a universal event. And in order to nail down the point of why we can know that is a universal event, he brings us to the flood as a universal event. So the universality of all three is
mm,
necessary for Peter's argument. And so when Craig says, maybe it could just be him referring to a story, the problem is that in order for the future return of Christ to have any merit, these events have to be historically grounded. They have to have occurred, because you can't say that because George Washington never told a lie and because Abe Lincoln was an honest man, you can know that I, running for president, am an honest man, right? That doesn't work, right? Because we know those people and we know their reputations, but that doesn't really connect to the real world, because we know those are myths. If, on the other hand, you said that George Washington was a president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln was a president of the United States, and if elected, I will be president of the United States, that forms the tight historical connection between those. For Peter, the way that he justifies the universality of Jesus's return is to point to the universal nature of creation and the
mm,
universal nature of the flood. So what I find interesting here is, you mentioned he didn't talk about this much in his book either. Craig just kind of says, maybe they're just addressing a story. But a storyline flood doesn't give the security of the believers for an understanding of Jesus's return. A mythical event, and Craig says this very nicely in his book when he's talking about Adam. And I ended up quoting that in my response to Craig's
right.
point here. Let me just pull it up so that I say it properly here. Um, let's see. Okay, let's see. Right. So one of the things that Craig had said in his book was that an action that is wholly internal to a fiction cannot have real world effects. So he was saying that within the context of Romans 5, that Adam's fall had to have happened in real time and real space in order to have real world effects. And I completely agree. I think that's a great sentence that Craig has in his book. It's a gem. But it also applies here, because the flood and creation cannot have any sort of way of grounding the individual for a future event in this timeline if those justifications didn't happen in our timeline, in our space-time continuum. So that's what I would say for Craig's response there, is that it can't be assertorical. It can't be illustrative. It has to be assertorical. It has to be one of the things that the writer Peter is saying does exist. And to jump off instead and say, well, then that's, Peter talks about these other things, or other New Testament writers talk about other things, is, that's smoke and mirrors. That's not talking about the text in particular that's in question. So, sorry, that's a bit of a dodge there.
So just for some clarity there, so assertorical, I did read that in Craig's book a lot. So what does that mean?
It means, it's a hard word to read. Every time you read it, you're like, I don't know that I like this word being used for the Bible. But it's asserting a fact. Okay. So when Craig does this whole division between assertorical and illustrative uses, the assertorical uses are when you're asserting this is an actual event, this happened in space and time. Illustrative is you're dealing with a character in a story. They might be the same, like Adam or Noah could be both in Craig's mind. Assertorical, we're talking about a real Noah, and illustrative, we're talking about the flood, that we have on cribs and stuff like that. Just water comes in and washes it all away. Yeah. So the real statements of history versus simply using the stories to make a point. Okay. And like I said, I don't think that that's going to end up working well in the New Testament. You just end up having to take a pair of tweezers and a scalpel to the text and just work on trying to pull the strands apart when I think they're woven as a cord.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if I could put my William Craig hat on, William Lane Craig, he probably has like 3 fans in the chat right now at most. But for the few people out there that are watching and say, hey, what about this? So I could see, even though he doesn't go into detail, maybe I think we can like still man his argument here. So like, you said that, hey, if it's just an illustration, it's not based on reality. So like, we can't really, you can't like make future assumptions based off of that. Is that a good summary of what you're saying?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Sure. So like in this narrative, like, so he's Peter is mentioning the creation as well as the flood, and he's like, hey, it seems like he's saying, hey, they forgot about, like, these other non-Christians, they forgot about this, and therefore they don't realize that they're going to miss what's going to happen in the future. Like, almost like we can almost predict that what's going to happen in the future because of the past. And what you're saying is like, hey, if what happened in the past is not historical, then you can't like base what's going to happen in the future.
Right. I would say, you don't have a real world grounding to the argument. That seems to be what Peter's making. There.
Okay. So if I could put Craig's hat on, what if so you realize myth is true in some regard, maybe not historically true, but true, and like it's just giving facts about the world. So like, for example, you mentioned the whole cherry tree incident. So that probably didn't happen, but it conveys something about Abraham Lincoln, where was it, Washington?
Washington,
I feel like such a loser for not knowing that. Washington. But what it does convey is that Washington was a very honest person. So and whether that's actual true or not, I don't know. But so like maybe that's what this text is saying is like, hey, the the Peter is referring to the flood and creation, and it's using the narrative of Genesis, and even though it references Genesis, it's not making a historical claim. It's referring to the truth that's behind the what that text is claiming, which is that that I'm not a scholar in this and for Second Peter, but it's the idea that like what happens in like originally creation is like destroying with what like let me just actually read it. It says, "For they deliberately suppress this fact that by the word of God heavens existed long ago, and an earth was formed out of water and by means of water. Through these things, the world existing at the time was destroyed when it was deluged with water." So like you don't see like any like mythical meaning behind that, which could convey what Peter's trying to say without saying that it's historical. You don't see that as possible in any way.
Okay, that's well put. No, I don't see that as being something that can be justified non-historically. So when we back up a couple of verses to see what the charge is, right, that all things continue just as they have from the beginning of creation. Basically, the argument is people don't rise from the dead. When people die, they always die. It's been this way since the very beginning. All things continue, right? And Peter is saying, no, actually, things don't always continue just as they have since the beginning of creation. Mm-hmm. There was an event of creation. There was a flood that was completely different from everything else, that was cosmic in nature. And I would add to that worldwide or universal. And therefore, Jesus's return is going to be like these other two things, right? Is the creation mythical? Not in terms of standing outside of history. It can be written in sort of mythical language or what have you, but I don't think that it's sitting outside of history. And I don't think Peter's making that argument. We have creation. That's the one point of agreement that they have. And Peter is reminding them of something that they ought to know and should be cognizant of, and that is that there has been an event that was unlike anything else in history, and that was the flood, which used the creation waters, right? It used the primeval waters to destroy the earth all over again. And that destruction is a picture then of the type of destruction that is going to be coming when Jesus finally returns. It'll be different with Jesus because we don't have another flood. We have a world that is destroyed by fire or what have you. But I don't think that Peter's argument has any force at all if there is no historical event in between there. And I don't think that either Peter or the original hearers would have reacted kindly if somebody said, well, yeah, but that's the story of the flood. It doesn't really matter to whether or not Jesus returns.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that commentary there. Maybe, just maybe, William Craig will notice and say, hey, but what about this? And then maybe we can have a fun conversation about that.
Right. That's what these books are for, right? To get people up and going.
Yeah, no, but like, seriously, I'm like, he mentions it and he doesn't give any justification for it. And I'm just like, ah.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that you had mentioned was, you were reading through these, and every once in a while, like, oh, I wish they would have made this argument or, this. And, there's each of us were given a space constraint of 6,000 to 8,000 words for the body of the text. That as I was going through, they didn't say anything about footnotes. And a friend of mine was like, if they didn't say anything about footnotes, you can load up the footnotes. So, one of the things that you'll notice is honestly, the chapters vary a good bit in content. Kenton's chapter is quite long. His footnoting is modest to moderate, but he just kind of he blew past the word count. He did like 12,000 or 10,000 plus words. Craig, he was really light. I was honestly very surprised, given the nature of his book, In Quest of the Historical Adam, that his chapter came in at like 6,400 words with like 18 brief little footnotes. A couple that are a little bit larger, but it was a really quick read. Andrew comes in probably with what I would think the editor was hoping for, a sweet spot. He comes in close to that 8,000, 7,500, and he's got a good amount of footnotes. whereas I hit, just under 8,000, but I,
Mm-hmm.
packed another 4,000 or so worth of words in the footnotes. So my chapter ends up being quite long. And I also have a number of illustrations that I put in to hopefully help the reader visually grasp a couple of the things that we're talking about, and even use some illustrations in my responses to Kenton and to Andrew to try and help people see, science concepts, especially, which are difficult to simply describe. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, then Broadman Holman is getting a bargain, because
Mm.
in a page that would have 350, I've got 1,000 with that paper with that illustration.
Yeah, yeah. I appreciate that. Right. So, these great books are great for like getting like the best of both views, essentially, like the reason to accept the view and the reasons to reject it, which I think is very important. Like I think that almost all arguments, they sound great at first, and then
Mm.
you read the objections, like, oh, maybe that's not actually a good thing. But I do really like that about these books. But that is sad that you only have so much space. So yeah, so I did want to. It's while we were on that topic of Second Peter there. I wanted to talk about what Loke said. So Loke responded to you in basically academia.u on his little EDU's page there.
Yeah.
It was just a very brief footnote. So I wanted to mention what he said in the book first. Let me see if I can find it. Uh, nope, nope, that's not it. We'll get there. Okay, here we go. All right. So can you see it okay? I can just
Sure. Is
read it if
that
you can't see it.
page, what's that, page 193 or
Yep.
109? Okay.
Yeah, 193.
193. All right.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yep. So he says early scriptural commentaries on the waters on creation day of Genesis in Psalm 104 imply that the flood in Genesis 6 and 9 should not be understood as covering the entire earth, but merely of sufficient extent for destroying the world of the ungodly humans. 2 Peter 2:5. So before I know you had a whole commentary on Psalm 104. We could certainly talk about that, but that might be a whole can of worms. But specifically on Second Peter, then he later, I guess he doesn't go fully in detail there, but he's basically like, hey, yeah, it's referring to just the ungodly humans, not the whole earth. Um, and then, was there anything else that he mentioned on that topic?
Let's see.
If he did, I don't have it. That's okay.
Yeah,
But he
I don't think there was anything else on Second Peter there besides that.
Okay. All right. Well, you responded to it, and you can add to this commentary here. But you responded to it. I wanted people to get an idea of what you thought of that, and like the idea that, hey, Second Peter is not global. It's actually referring to the humans or whatever. Um,
Hmm.
he
Yeah, this
doesn't
is
quote.
a. Oh, go ahead.
Before we get into that, I just want to represent. So like he
Yeah.
doesn't go specifically into your like real detail your view in his commentary here. Please add if you want to add something. You've already kind of talked about it generally though. But just for the audience, he says Roston argues likewise. Loke's functional flood produces strained arguments. To return to 2 Peter 3, this passage does not set up a functional future judgment, but a physical one. So that was what you said. And then he says here, Ross is setting up a false dichotomy. I do not deny that the flood is physical. Rather, my point is that the physical flood was intended to fulfill a particular function of wiping out the ungodly humans. So I guess that doesn't
Mhm.
really address the argument you've made about all these parallelisms and um, the the whole creation, obviously being the
Mhm.
whole creation. Um, and then the final judgment also being kind of like a global thing. Is that how you kind of would respond to that, or would you add more something to it?
Yeah, I think to help round out what I think Andrew's getting at with this is he's trying to cleave a distinction between the world of the ungodly and the world as a whole,
Yeah.
and say that we could have a local flood that wipes out the world of the ungodly, and that is a subset of the broader planet itself. So you
Mm.
see similar types of arguments with, say, Hugh Ross, with Reasons to Believe. They use the same sort of approach when dealing with the Second Peter chapter, they try and focus on this world of the ungodly as if this is a
Mhm.
subset of creation. I don't, again, for the threefold parallels that are set up there between the original creation and the parousia, I don't see how you end up with something that is anything less than cosmic and universal for the flood, and not just universal for people. I think that also requires that you bring to the text an idea that people's geographic location was quite restricted and limited. And I don't think that's, I think that's something that you definitely are adding and bringing to the text rather than drawing out from it. If you're going to go back to Genesis 6 and kind of see the condition of the world at the time, there's no hint that humanity is in some sense limited only to a certain area, which is what Loke argues, not only in his chapter but also in his book, that this is just a geographically restricted area for the people who have descended from Adam in particular. It's not even the rest of the people outside that are genealogically not connected to him, so they don't get affected by the flood. It's only a flood to wipe out not all people, just the people who descend from Adam who have gone ungodly in some way. I think that that's a really strange type of model to propose, and really requires bringing a whole lot to the text that isn't there. It just becomes very, very, I think, implausible and even convoluted to try and make these arguments. But nonetheless, he's at least trying to come at it and say geographically localized because it's only the world of the ungodly. But I think the world of the ungodly is coextensive with the world as far as Genesis 6, 7, 8, 9 is considered.
Okay, awesome. All right, so we're about the hour mark. We can
Yeah.
talk and talk and talk. At the same time, I want to respect your time. So was there anything else you want to talk about? We could go through Loke's argument, or other arguments, or we can just call it quits and do something else some other time. What do you want to do?
Well, I'd like to hear some more of your thoughts, actually, as you've gone through the book.
Okay.
You get you get guys like me talking and talking, which is great, and I really appreciate that. But you run a smart YouTube channel. You listen to a lot of interesting folks and have a lot of great guests on. So for you, you said you really like these perspectives books, right?
Yep.
They do. So as you read through, what would you say for some of the authors is a high point of their argument, and
Oh
one
man.
thing that you'd say, yeah, I don't think this does the work that you hope for. And I'm right in there, so I
Yeah.
got a thick
Yeah.
skin.
Yeah. I don't give my thoughts a lot on this channel. But okay. So a couple of things. Oh, sure. We can start with Sparks here. So yeah, once again, like I think he brings some interesting ideas to the table. The whole just like saying, "Hey, it's not inerrant." I find that really interesting. I don't know if he did a good job arguing it. The thing that I found most problematic with this book was not like the ideas. I thought they had interesting ideas, but just like the arguments for the ideas.
Hmm.
Like, so like you talked about with Craig, like the serpent and like Jesus or God in the garden, like those aren't obviously um like mythical. So like what is the actual argument or the evidence you're bringing to the table? Like is that it? That kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, and the same thing. Well, Sparks is interesting because like he took just like very very literal views for the text, like some things that you wouldn't even consider literal. Um, so um, yeah, I don't the whole inerrancy question. I think he could have done a little bit better job fleshing that out if we're gonna argue that or not argue it. I don't know what to think of Loke. It seems like he's just arguing that it's possible, not that it's likely. And like I can admit, like, hey, it's possible, but I guess the question is like, is it a 0.0001% chance, or
Hmm.
is it like a 10% chance that it's true? Um, I think that's helpful for people that are saying like, hey, like I know Christianity is true, and for whatever reason they think, oh, they definitely evolution is true. Something we got to figure out a way to do this. Like I think that's helpful for that, but uh, it does seem like maybe things here or there might be a little ad hoc, as some people would say.
Mm.
Um, like, was that really what the original writer was intending with that? Um, Craig, I found most interesting, but I think that as I said there, the way some of the ways he's argued, I was just like, I don't know why you would conclude this, or like the second Peter thing, like he just asserts it, and it's like,
Yeah.
that's got to be really big. Like if you want to say your view is correct, you have to be able to justify those like, you know, harsh reasons or like the main negatives to accept it. Like the actual critique, you got to be able to address it. I don't think he necessarily addressed all those very well. Um,
It's funny that you mentioned that because
yeah,
for readers of the book, they'll find that Craig lobs that accusation at both Kenton and myself of saying that you presented your view, but you didn't argue for it. Which I kind of go, well, I don't know that I think that's quite right. But yeah, I
yeah,
think more frequently we see Craig just kind of tossing out something and saying this is just the way it is, and no footnote or whatever. It's just that's it. And I found that unfortunate. I was really actually kind of hoping in the early phases of getting this book going that I would have had more substantive pushback from Craig in particular on this.
mm,
To Andrew Loke's credit, we haven't talked about him very much in this episode, and that's all right. But I will give Loke credit. I mean, he read through each of the other chapters very carefully. He lays out his objections to the views, sometimes in pretty rapid fire, and lots of them. But nonetheless, he took a lot of care in reading and comprehending and then responding. So I think that accepting myself out of this because I don't want to say me or whatever, but I think Loke did a very nice job of interacting. I don't think that his chapter was as powerful as it could have been, but I do
mm,
think that his interactions in asking questions and bringing up objections was very substantive. Even if in the end I don't find some of his objections powerful enough, he was a good contributor in that regard to the book.
yeah, yeah. In regards to yours, I found yours to be the most rigorous, which is
Oh, thank you.
that's fun. Yeah. I was like, oh yeah, that's an interesting argument. I didn't think about it like that. Um, which is always fun, like specifically for me who, I feel
You
like
pay a
I've
lot
read a
of
lot of
attention to this
literature,
stuff.
right?
Yeah.
Um, and especially like on the young Earth creationist side too, because like that's like what I grew up with. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's that like think about Henry Morris, like when he like really started like, making these arguments for young Earth creationism. That's what 60, what was that? That was like the 60s. So that's
Yeah.
60
60
years
years.
of this view to really be articulated well. And then, so like, I would say like I've heard like most of it, but then you come along, give another one. I'm like, okay, that's really interesting. That doesn't happen often for the younger for you, I would say. But um, um, I found it interesting that Craig did say that like you didn't present evidence. So like you mentioned Second Peter, you didn't give like a super rigorous like. I don't. Maybe I'm misrepresenting you, but it seemed like you were like, yeah, Second Peter. Well, actually, no, you did talk about the parallelism of the book, didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, I mean
what
it
that
was
does,
brief.
yeah,
I'll put it that with so much work that I was trying to do to set up Old Testament, New
yeah,
Testament geological context and talk about the anthropology, which is something we haven't talked really at all
yeah,
about this. We haven't talked about the science end of things. Yeah, 8,000 words went through really fast, and it
right,
was just everything ended up on the cutting room floor.
right,
So yeah, Second Peter got like one, maybe two paragraphs for
yeah,
that. And I had actually brought my manuscript to my pastoral staff here in Lynchburg and asked if they would take a look at it and read
mm.
it. And one of the things they said is we want to see more about what you're talking about in Second Peter. There needs to be more of this
Oh,
in
okay,
here. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to add any more. But I
yeah,
certainly hope to in the future to bring that out because
yeah,
I think there's a lot more.
yeah.
But you go ahead and hit me with some of the things that you wish I would have been able to do better.
No, so, uh, s- uh, I found Craig's critique really interesting because,
Mm,
like you mentioned, Second Peter. So, assuming that your argument is correct, which I don't have any firm reason to reject that, that like if Second Peter thought the writer of Second Peter thought, hey, the flood was global and historical, what that means is at least the whole globe, the flood section of Genesis 1 to 11, that is at least the main part of it is historical. That there was a global flood, that there was a historical Noah. Then you have the genealogies. You argued that those were historical. Craig agrees. Loke agreed that those were historical. Then you have uh, Paul's references to Adam. Um, so um, uh, Craig also viewed, at least Adam being historical and Adam sinning in some regard as historical. With that being said, I didn't see any further argumentation like, from the New Testament of maybe I missed it, like the Tower of Babel, like was that
mm,
historical? Or um, like the Noah and the nakedness part. Like
mm,
so what I'm saying is like, hey, you could say like bits and pieces of Genesis 1 to 11 are historical, which someone like Craig or Walton would say is true, but like that doesn't mean all of it is historical. So that's what I would have liked to hear a little bit more. So maybe you could give your thoughts on that, why you didn't include that, or what your methodology is there.
yeah, that's a good point. Because I think that certainly my position is that there's a lot more historical going on than Craig or Walton, are going to
Right.
argue for in their own different kinds of ways. Um, and I'm going to, I think, be more specific about what I think is historical, probably than either one of them are. Craig's whole approach is kind of this minimalistic, you know,
Mm,
affirmations. What do we absolutely need?
right.
And if we've got that, then in a sense, not that the rest of it doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter nearly so much, right? As long as we've got these core affirmations. And Walton, in his own way, is fairly similar. He's not going to be too bothered about the historical details as long as a couple of historical aspects are there.
Mm,
Um, I would say that on some of the things that you mentioned, like Noah and nakedness and things like that, yeah, I would say that those are historical events, um, and obviously intended to be literary parallels at the same time to what happened with Adam. I mean, you've
yep.
got nakedness and some fruit and sin and a problem, right? And you end up with you know somebody who is clothed but then partakes of a fruit and then is naked, and there's sin and a problem. So sure, yeah, there's absolutely a way in which the writer of Genesis is trying to tell us history has a tendency to repeat itself, or if nothing else, it rhymes.
Mm,
It looks pretty similar to show us that Noah is, even though he is better than Adam in so many ways, right? He is so superior to Adam. He never speaks during the flood account at all. He simply is recorded as doing whatever it is that God said. Whereas Adam is given one thing that he's told not to do, and he does it. And then his whole speech is all about blame shifting, right? Everything in there is about blame shifting. So there's these interesting ways in which the characters are compared and contrast. And as a young Earth creationist, we need to recognize that kind of literary development that is working in the text of Genesis 1 through 11, for example, and extending out into Genesis 14 and 15 and 19 and 30, right? The patterns that are set up with Adam have a way of continuing and falling out through the characters as you go through. Everybody has problems. Everybody has troubles. There's always problems with brothers, right? All those sorts of things are in there. Brothers wanting to kill other brothers, and some successfully, Cain and Abel, and others not successful, right? Esau does not kill Jacob, but he wants to. And so the writer is, I think, utilizing these real historical events, but also literarily crafting them in such a way to help move us into a certain theological direction, historical direction, a narrative that helps to build
mm,
up Israel, but remind Israel that life is difficult, sin is ever present, and it's at the door waiting for you, and it's always been waiting for you and for all your kin. And if some of the details are, I wouldn't even say like manufactured, not manufactured. I think that the details are selected in the same way that that modern writers will select aspects of history in order to put together a point for a story, right? Talking again about Honest Abe and George Washington not able to tell a lie. If you wanted to craft something, you could take those, but you could also take the real events upon which those are. That would be, I think, better comparison to the biblical narrative, is that George Washington was known for being a tremendously honest broker. The man stepped down from being president after his second term, not because people didn't want him to be president. They wanted him to continue. Some people wanted him to be king, but he was so humble and he recognized the need that the nation had that he said 2 terms and that's it. And nobody, because of the sheer amazing reputation of Washington, nobody did anything different until FDR, right? And FDR took 4 terms. And after that, we made a law and said nobody can do this. So I think that, if you're a historian who wants to write a neat history story that has all the fun little facts and whatnot, you can pick and choose and arrange the events of people's lives and times in order to move a story to a particular direction. And I would say that the writer of Genesis is doing the same thing. We have real events throughout these people's lives, but it's not like their lives are only the garden, the fall, and having a couple of kids. There's a whole bunch of other things that happened. We're not in on that, because it's not germane to the story that Israel needs, which is the story that ultimately we're going to need in finding out about the Savior, Jesus Christ. So that would be, I think, a fuller kind of treatment of how I look at those biblical texts as historical, selectively historical, and arranged towards particular ends. And that's why they read like stories. My kids will pull a history storybook off of the shelf and they'll read it. And because this isn't a footnoted, treatise done by, ex-historian at this great university, is it not history? No, it is history. It's just history of a different sort. And as you're very fond of mentioning, and many of others in especially Old Testament and biblical studies, the Bible's not a historical book, or Genesis is not a historical book in the same way that we look at a modern 21st century history. But I would say, does the biblical author and subsequent biblical authors view Genesis as providing us with historical information that is reliable and true and based in our space-time continuum? I would say yes. And that's where I would stand, and why I stand as a young Earth creationist.
All right. And I think it's certainly good reasons you wouldn't have mentioned all of that, considering space. With
Yes.
that being said, there's certainly, I would totally agree that there's something going on with Noah and the Adam comparisons. No doubt about it. And I think you did argue that there are a lot of parallels going on in the text. You brought out your charts, which was really helpful. I think this might have been why Craig responded that way, even though you did mention the Second Peter and the Adam historical and the Genesis 5, is because, like, the mentions of the snake and the mentions of God walking in the garden, like, what he wanted, I think, is like an argument for why those are historical. Like, why should we accept it as historical? And I think what maybe, if I could read his mind based off of limited information, is he like, for your case to be correct, you have to say, like, this happened at this time period 6,000 or so years ago, or maybe 10,000, but around that time period. And for that to happen, you have to have Genesis 1, and then you have the whole that narrative, I guess you argue, is in day 6, and then you have, after that is Cain and Abel, and after that is the flood, and surely there was some stuff in between, but all that was really packed in close. So like, I guess if you say, hey, some of that is not historical, then that really opens the idea of, like, I guess, gaps essentially in time. Now maybe you could argue, like, hey, Genesis 5 is like, there's no gaps here.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, looking at the responses to my chapter, especially from Craig and Loke, because
Hmm.
both of them uh, take aim at me for not doing a full, robust defense of young Earth creationism. Both of them say, I didn't talk about distant starlight and the origin of the universe. Therefore, your view, you failed to justify your view. It's like, well, we weren't actually told. I wasn't told to deal with stars. I was told to deal with Adam. I kind
Yeah.
of chide them a little bit in my response to that because, asking me, how, or Craig bringing up, how did koalas and kangaroos get to Australia? You didn't explain that, so you haven't justified your case. Kind of like, that's a little far afield. And granted, I understand that there are those questions for young Earth creationism, sure. But I wasn't asked to give a full defense of young Earth creationism. I was supposed to present a young Earth creationist perspective on Adam.
Right.
And I hope that I did that to the best, certainly, of my own ability. I hope that the readers find it edifying and informative. And I appreciate very much the way that you had said, you learned some things or saw some arguments that you hadn't seen before. Because you and I have interacted a good number of times in the past, and I really appreciate the depth that you bring to these kinds of discussions. And it's something that, quite honestly, in young Earth creationism hasn't been done very well. And for my own part, if you had talked to the younger me 10 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to write a chapter like this at all. It would have been, not boilerplate young Earth creationism, but it would have been more similar to the typical types of arguments that you get. But I'm very fortunate to have worked at Liberty University with a bunch of theologians that are there, and
Mm.
I'm related to a biblical theologian in Old Testament, and so they are constantly chucking books at me saying, "You better read this because you got to know something better than this, right? These arguments aren't good. You need better arguments."
Yep.
And it's helped me to start developing now, which is kind of amazing. Some of my own arguments for how I might read the days or how I might understand things. And some things that every once in a while I actually saw something like, I don't think I've ever read anybody. And I've read 15 commentaries and 40 other books. And I haven't seen anybody bring this aspect out yet. And I think this actually has an important way of looking at, say, Genesis 1, for example, or something else. So one of the things that I hope that people will come away with this is that young Earth creationism, even though it's often kind of thought as like, this is the surface reading of the text, or this is the plain meaning of the text, that term is used all the time.
Mm.
And I get it. I mean, I think that a young Earth creation perspective is at one level the plain meaning of the text. But as I said, it also means that, if it really is the plain meaning of the text, it should have deep roots
Mm.
as well. And I hope in this, I've at least started the process of people seeing that young Earth creationism has a much more robust theological footing to it than simply the days are the days and the genealogies need to be read this way and the flood was global because all the high hills under the whole heavens. I think all of those things are true, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. And I hope also that when they read this and they get into the second half of the chapter, which deals with the science of anthropology and how we identify humans and what species in the fossil record may be human and may not be, they're going to be very surprised, I think, to see how young Earth creationists have actually had a long history of working on this issue, and that someone like Bill Craig, in advocating Neanderthals as humans, actually ends up in agreement with a longstanding position with young Earth creationists on this. I can pull back a book by, of all people, George McCready Price, right? The great granddaddy of young Earth creationism, writing in 1921, 103 years ago, saying about one of the Neanderthal skeletons that was found in Belgium, that it looks like this man was buried there by his friends. Right. So, here you got a guy writing in the 1920s when Neanderthals are still fairly new things and we don't have a whole lot of skeletons. We got some, and he's assigning full humanity to the Neanderthals. And young Earth creationists have consistently done that and viewing them in a post-flood situation. So that'll be for, the viewers to kind of pull out the book and say, what is he talking post-flood? Yeah, that the Neanderthals, Homo erectus, and several others actually represent what I think are people groups that are post-flood. either post Babel or, kind of however that works out. There's a couple of options I think we have on the table for what to do with Babel. But my perspective on what counts as human and what would have been considered human is fairly broad enough that when Bill Craig first read my chapter, I think he just about spewed his port as he was, sitting there, because he types out on Facebook. He's like, the young Earth creationist is a bigger evolutionist than I am. And it's like, well, no, I'm not. But I can see, how you find this a fun way to kind of put it. He views, Neanderthals and us as humans, and Heidelbergensis and Denisovans. And I expand that even more into some things that Craig doesn't want to put into humanity. And so we have some good interaction and dialogue in the chapters as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on here. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
I always love to hear what you have to say. Everybody go check out the book for 4 really interesting, helpful perspectives on the historical Adam and Eve. Of course, you can check out our other videos with Marcus Ross that we've had on the channel. One specifically on the days of Genesis, whether they were 24-hour days. Was there any other resources you want people to check out for you? Of course, you can get this on Amazon and your website. It's in the description.
That's right. Yeah, people can hop over to the company that I run, Cornerstone Educational Supply, and yep, we've got copies too over here. We'd be happy to send them out your way, and I'll autograph them and send you a nice little note on the inside. So, yep.
Oh yeah,
I did it exact. So I'd be happy to sign the book for anybody who might like it. But yeah, I'm very appreciative of the opportunity. I certainly hope that the book is received well and that it's seen for the type of cordial dialogue on this topic that, at least from my own part, I think we sorely need, especially from the young Earth creation camp. We need people to talk a little nicer and not get so grouchy with each other. But that kind of cuts across all of us. So
yeah, for sure. So for people listening, I will actually be interviewing Andrew Loke on this topic on Saturday at 7 or 9 a.m. Eastern time. Don't quote me on that. But yeah, so that'll be fun. People can check that out. Marcus, we can do a response to that later if you want. But yeah, right. So we'll do a response to a response to the response to the response. But yeah, once again, thank you. There you go. Well, anyways, thank you so much for coming on here. It's been fun. And until next time, hope you guys have a good one.